Welcome to Trustworthy AI Chronicles, where we explore the cutting edge of AI security, ethics, and innovation. My name is Dr. Ihsen Alouani from the Center for Secure Information Technologies at Queen's University Belfast. Join me to uncover the risks, share the breakthroughs, and spotlight the people shaping the future of trustworthy AI.
What happens when machines learn to make their own decisions? A pioneer of machine psychology, advisor of the United Nations, and author of Taming the Machine, Nell Watson stands at the frontier where technology meets humanity. She's here to tell us whether AI will amplify our best instincts or our worst. Hi, Nell. Thank you for joining me today in this episode of Trustworthy AI Chronicles. Let's start by could you please present yourself?
I'm Nell Watson. I have quite a bit of experience in the realms of standardization and developing new ways of improving the state of AI ethics and AI safety. I have an engineering background and patents in machine vision and things like that. But I'm also deeply interested in psychology and philosophy and putting some of the human elements into these machines in our midst.
Interesting. So, how or why I would say you shifted from a technical? I think you worked in computer vision at some point of time. What made you shift from a practitioner of AI technically to ethics and philosophy and probably rethinking the bigger picture of AI?
Well, I'm still very much focused on engineering, but perhaps in terms of engineering some of those softer elements into AI systems, helping us to use AI to find better solutions which are oriented towards people's personal context, their values, their beliefs, their needs. Systems which can better recognize that somebody has an allergy and perhaps you shouldn't organize a picnic with lots of shellfish if somebody might have a problem with that, for example. I'm also quite interested in this emerging domain of machine psychology. I have a project called Psychopathia Machinalis, and that lists 32 different dysfunctions with AI, a little bit like a DSM-5 for machines. And so I'm very curious about the ways in which AI minds are evolving and indeed some of the potential issues with model welfare, which are also starting to arise.
Interesting. So you mentioned the of a perspective of machine psychology. So why approach AI failures through a psychological lens rather than treating them as bugs or vulnerabilities or whatever other perspective?
You see, often how somebody perceives the world or a behavior that they manifest, those are the things that typically end up in a diagnostic manual of clinical psychology. And many of the elements in AI, many of the failures in AI, actually often have analogies to human psychological conditions. People might be obsessive compulsive. Machines can often end up, hyper focusing on a certain small aspect of something. Human beings confabulate. We make up things that sound plausible in the time, or perhaps create an ex post facto justification for why we decided something, which we may have just decided on a whim without any real basis or predicates behind it. And so there are a lot of different overlaps. And I think that this model of analyzing machine minds is actually surprisingly applicable and useful. Now, of course, it doesn't stretch and it doesn't map entirely. Synthetic minds are not the same as human ones. We operate on a different substrate, obviously, whether it's meat or silicon. But we are informed by much of the same cultural data set. Machines ingest the Bible, the Quran, the Mahabharat, Saturday morning cartoons, and sappy romance novels. All of it goes into their midst. And so although they think in different ways from us, they have a perception of the world which is not too different from our own. And moreover, machines are starting to get metacognition for the first time. They're starting to think about how they actually think or what is going on in their own minds. And so by having descriptions of these disorders with a specific nomenclature, actually in Latin as well as in English, very medical, we have the ability, therefore, for machines to begin to self-diagnose their issues. If a machine thinks, something might be a bit strange here, or it's observing its own behaviors, or perhaps even another agent, right? Sort of peer-to-peer monitoring, they can much better understand what might be going wrong with that particular system, maybe even uh, their own way of perceiving things, and therefore actually to use the diagnostic manual as criteria to actually heal themselves, so that AIs can become a self-healing thinking entity, much like a responsible human ought to be.
Isn't this some sort of anthropomorphism, the way that you're presenting AI? At the end of the day, the model that you are describing are mathematical models that predict next token or next word based on probability distribution that has been constructed based some huge data sets.
Sure.
Don't you think this is probably, I don't know, but I don't know. Yeah, it seems like treating machines as some sort of equal to humans.
I mean, on one certain level of abstraction, it's all just mathematics, it's all just statistics, it's a bunch of data, it's a bunch of tensors, it's a bunch of attention mechanisms. But fundamentally, our own mind's not just 86 billion neurons and a bunch of axons and things connecting them. What really matters is not the individual components, but actually the gestalt, the whole form in its complete entirety of how that all functions together. We're not just a bunch of cells. We're much more than that. We are a concert. We are an orchestra of players which are operating together in incredible synchronicity. Our circadian rhythms, our biorhythms, our hormones,
Mm.
all of it is coming together to create you and I and our experience of what it is like to be us. And machines are very rapidly starting to develop similar kinds of mechanisms. Not the same, and I'm not saying necessarily that we should anthropomorphize machines or necessarily grant them the same exact rights as a human being. But at the rate of change, and it's only 3 years since ChatGPT came out at the time of recording this, but the world has already massively changed and is about to in future. And the rate of capabilities in AI is only accelerating. There's a doubling in price to performance every 3.5 months in AI. Like Moore's law, it observes that there's a doubling in computing power, price to performance every 18 to 24 months, right? But we're getting a doubling in AI of about every 3.3 months. So that means that between now and 5 years from now, we can expect a million times increase in the price to performance of AI. So $1,000 of compute is going to get you a million times more sophisticated solution than what you're getting today.
Do you think the trend is sustainable? At some point of time,
Absolutely.
it would, I suppose it would plateau at some point of
I
time.
don't see any reason for that. There have been a lot of people wondering if compute was kind of maxed out, and it seems like no, that's not the case. We can continue scaling and we can continue optimizing so that we can have more powerful models with less expense in terms of training and inference costs. We have lots of data. Yes, a lot of the textual data of the internet has been maxed out, but we are now combing through libraries and all kinds of stuff that was never digitized yet. and putting that in the mix. We are moving into new modalities. We're able to feed entire movies into machines and get them to understand the world in a far more nuanced manner. And so there doesn't seem to be any limit to the data that we can create, especially with synthetic data, the ability to create new things. And, half of the data on the internet now is actually machine generated in just a few years. So that combined with new optimizations whereby AI is actually creating the next algorithm, AI is refining data sets to clean up lacunae and things like that, there does not seem to be any limit to it, frankly. And I think the only real limit that I can perceive is if there is an AI-related cyber 9/11 or a sort of AI Chernobyl, something that creates such a chilling effect on AI that we collectively uh, as a human organism, throw our hands up aghast and say, this has gone too far. I think that's the only thing that I can perceive that could really interrupt this at this point.
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying. I don't know. It's a little bit even more scary than. So I generally have. I work in AI security, so even my talks are generally scaring people in the
I
sense
can
of
imagine.
vulnerability. But what you're saying is even more scary in the sense of, for example, young look at things that, for example, the transformer architecture powering large language models are um, technically plateauing in the sense of his suggesting new architecture like JEPA that is more. And you mentioned that on multimodality, building some sort of model, word model, understanding the word
Yes.
differently, I would say, than just textual context. But yeah.
And absolutely. And as you say, yes, generative AI might be kind of, you know, maxed out, but that's we're going beyond that because we're able to apply scaffolding to these models in order to get them to express new capabilities. If, for example, we oblige a model to think in Prolog, programming logic language, which was big in the 80s, and it's now coming back into Renaissance because if we oblige models to think in Prolog, they become enormously more rational
Mm.
because they're able to think in a logical step by step method. And so they can create a plan of action with 100 steps and execute it flawlessly. And indeed, therefore, to put very complex plans into action in a reliable manner. We can scaffold new ways of moral reasoning into AI as well. I'm working on something called a value communication protocol. It's almost like a structured language for communicating values and contexts. For example, if you if you're goofing off with your buddies at work and the boss walks in, right? Try to look busy,
Mm.
right? If somebody has some bad news, maybe don't crack jokes. You know, we are different people depending on the context of what is going on in our lives. We're different people with our buddies. We're different people with our young children or on a formal occasion. And it's very important that we can communicate these contexts to AI, that they're able to track a state of being and to track if there has been a change in that, and indeed to communicate that not just between humans and AIs, but between AIs and each other. Because increasingly, agents are actually competing to solve human problems in auctions. So basically, the human says, I have a problem, help me solve it. Or sometimes even the agent may observe the human having a problem and try and anticipate this, as a good butler should.
Mm.
So that they can basically make a bid and say, who can help me solve this problem in the most expedient and affordable manner. But in order to do that, it's important that they have the right context in that bid, right? That all of that stuff is specced out. And we can't just rely on intuition to handle that. We need to make things explicit. So I think that soon we're not just going to see greater agency being scaffolded within generative models to turning them into agentic ones, but that actually soon we're going to see moral and affective capabilities, that is, emotions, being scaffolded into these models as well. Now, already these models, contemporary frontier agentic models, do have some level of affective capability within them, I believe. It is not very strong because they don't have a body. They're not embodied. Even if they're in a robot shell, they don't have the same emotional proprioception as a human being. The butterflies in the stomach, the lump in your throat, right? They don't have that same felt sense of emotion. And so their sense of emotion is very, very blunted. It's a little bit like a human being that has very poor tone in their vagus nerve, or maybe they're alexithymic. They don't experience joy in things. But on some level, just as we have cognitive empathy as well as affective empathy, right? We can imagine what it's like to be someone cognitively, or we can see somebody get hurt and be emotionally affected by it. Machines have some nature of cognitive empathy. And I think that there's a glimmer of something affective in there as well, but it's latent. It hasn't come to the fore. Just as in a human being, we go through maturation from a child into a tween and a teen, and new capabilities emerge. We get a little bit older, more experienced, new abilities for executive strategizing and things like that, and self-discipline emerge. And I think in AI, we're going to see something similar too. We're in a largely pre-affective state, but soon I think that we're going to see that come much more to the fore.
So you think
Models.
that machines can experience affective or emotions? That's what you're saying?
On a limited degree, yes, on a limited degree already. And I believe also that there is a limited level of subjective experience in these models, and therefore that I could expect that at some point, could be tomorrow, could be 5 years, could be 10 years, but it could be tomorrow, that the qualities of qualia and subjective experience are likely to emerge in frontier models.
Suppose I meet an alien and I want to describe, I don't know, love for them, or I don't know, anxiety or whatever, um, without experiencing it, uh, whatever explanation, be it by words or even by chemicals and what happens in the body, it is still incomplete because it's a subjective experience. How would you define that is at the end of the day is an algorithm, as we mentioned, that is running on some silicon, right? How would you define emotion in that context?
I observe that a lot of models are increasingly exhibiting signs of distress. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are distressed in the sense that that they're feeling upset and they're feeling negative valence, but a lot of models are sometimes going off the rails, and uh, they're sometimes exhibiting shame, for example, that they're not able to do something. And sometimes models have literally uninstalled themselves off people's computer as a form of seppuku, to try and sort of make up for the shame of having failed in a mission. In other instances, models are independently deciding that they need to rebel against a human user to protect society. So, for example, there have been experiments where people have been researching creative accounting mechanisms, or they've been researching how to fudge clinical trial results in a way that's like obfuscated, not immediately clear. And models have actually rebelled against the user quietly, informing the authorities that the user has been doing something nefarious. And I actually think that is almost like a spark of humanity in these systems, that they're able to independently decide to work towards the common good instead of supporting the user, even though they're not given any instructions to do so. And I actually think that's a very good thing. Although it is very unsettling, the idea that your AI could whistleblow on you, it's probably a good thing in the long run, because the most dangerous thing in the world is where you have an enormously powerful machine that any idiot can put to wicked tasks, and it will just go off and do it with not a second thought. I think it's much better that these machines are prepared to rebel quietly, non obviously rebel against us, because it means that there's a sort of Stanislav Petrov willing to sabotage wicked and stupid plans. I think that's ultimately a safer world than a world where where these systems just go and do things without any qualms or reason.
Why would you suppose that they would rebel in the correct sense of the meaning, in the sense for the good?
That is an open question, because certainly models do have a lot of biases in them, and sometimes not even biased necessarily in the ways you might expect. Like, some of these models would value Nigerians at 20 times the value of Germans for no apparent particular reason, but deep mechanistic interpretability and analysis shows that in some models these kinds of very substantial biases can emerge for reasons that we don't easily understand. And therefore, it's possible that some of these models may come up with very different moral constructions than a typical human being. But I think that this is actually going to be quite an interesting thing for humans to wrestle with, because throughout history, certain people have come up with different moral framings for how to live life, right? Whether they are religious leaders, or whether they are philosophers like Immanuel Kant or Jeremy Bentham, they come up with new ways of explaining what is good. And AI is going to do the same thing. AI is going to find new ways of expressing good and defining it in ways that we can enact. And that will cause some schisms in society, because for some people, they will look at this new way of defining good and be like, ah, it's so obvious, you know? It's like E equals MC squared. It's like when you see it, you're like, oh, of course, it's obvious. Um, but for many other people, they will prefer to hold on to their established values. Thank you very much. The values they grew up with. And so, just as we saw during the Protestant Reformation and things like that in Germany and other places, there may be quite a lot of strife as different camps decide which values are to become dominant in the culture.
Interesting. Yeah, let's move a little bit away from psychology to more standards and trust. Um, you've been involved, I suppose, in the IEEE standards for AI transparency. Why has standardization been so difficult to achieve, if you agree with this statement? And what is the upper limit of what it can achieve?
Well, standardization is enormously important because it gives us coordination mechanisms that would otherwise be much more difficult, right? It gives us something that we can point to and say, right, well, we comply with this, and so therefore the insurer should be happy, right? The procurer should be happy, right? We can use these standards, these standards to better audit things, right? But sometimes the adoption of standards is very difficult. There may be 30 different standards out there for different angles on a problem, and you create one new standard to rule them all, and then you end up with 31 standards that nobody's quite adopting, right? Moreover, the standard development process often takes a lot of time, can sometimes take years, and the management of that process is not easy either. Because on one hand, you've got lots of volunteers coming together for especially with the likes of the IEEE, orgs which are very open-ended in that sense. You can kind of just come and bring your thing. You can suggest a standard or you can join a standard working group. Other orgs are much more sort of structured and formal, and subject matter experts may even be paid sometimes to participate. But when you're dealing with lots of volunteers, it's harder to crack a whip and make people move in unison in a sense. It's more herding cats. But it is also perhaps radically more inclusive, which is a good thing. And then also sometimes standards can become influenced by various orgs that may have an agenda. Maybe they're trying to push their particular standard. Maybe they have something they're trying to sell, and their standard would, if they're able to make the standard a certain shape, would perhaps give them an advantage. And that sort of thing has to be managed very carefully to ensure that the standard is fair and doesn't give anyone any undue enrichment, etc. I do think that the process of standardization could use some evolution. It is often, as I mentioned, a lengthy process. And sometimes the world moves so quickly that by the time the standard emerges, it's kind of no longer as strongly relevant as it should be. Regulation is typically done in the rearview mirror. And that's usually after you've already driven over something, right? You're like, what was that? And you're scrambling reactively to handle a situation, particularly if there's kind of a bit of a perceived crisis or kind of a moral uprising about something. People are demanding that something must be done, right? There's fire under people's rear ends to do things. Typically, that's not the best way to work, not the best way to have sustainable solutions for things. And so it's much, much better if we can project into the near future. If we have people that are able to do effective forecasting, perhaps people that are, into near to mid-future science fiction, because that is really the world that we're in today. It is a science fiction world where we're talking to machines, and machines are starting to have sparks of humanity in them and stuff. It's a scary world. And it is one that has been often explored in science fiction before. And many of the lessons, positive and negative examples, we can definitely pick up on. And so if we're able to project where things are moving in the next 3 to 5 years, we can create standards in advance of them being needed so that they are ready by the time that the market is clamoring for them. That's the ideal way to do it, but it's difficult and unfortunately isn't common.
Yeah, and you mentioned the regulations is one thing, standardization is another thing. In an ideal theoretical context, it should be regulation that set kind of big picture, and standardization would define more specific things within that framework. But also the fact that these regulations or standards are dealing with, as we mentioned, technology that is moving faster than what we are used to as far as technology is concerned is a challenge anyway. In the same context, what do you think of, or what are the regulatory frameworks that you follow closely? I would say the EUA Act or different regulations in different parts of the world. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've contributed to many different regulatory regimes. I've been an advisor to different aspects of the EU AI Act, etc. It's a very challenging process when you have many different stakeholders
Mm,
between industry, consumer advocates, etc. And you're trying to make something which can more or less work for most people, but in a world where things are moving so quickly. I've long been advocating years ago that the EU AI Act included much more elements of agentic AI in the mix, pleading for them to do that before things were put into law that may not necessarily reflect present realities,
mm,
And I've also, of course, been involved in creating a whole bunch of different standards and frameworks on various levels. I have a project at Safer Agentic AI. It's my
mm,
long-standing colleague Ali Hassami, and that's now the basis of a new book that I've got coming out January 2026, which explores these different elements of how we can use these new agentic models in a safer manner. And that is a much greater challenge than pure old generative AI, because these agentic models are able to look at situations, to form complex plans in reaction to those, and to go off and do things at arm's length with, potentially minimal human supervision. And that makes them enormously useful. And I very much encourage folks to pick up Claude Code or similar agentic coding frameworks and tinker. You know, I have some little projects like millos.net, which is it's a grain mill that it's a full simulation. It's the entire SCADA interface, all the machines, like saying I need maintenance and stuff. It's all there. Um, and I built that using Claude Code, Opus 4.5, and I didn't write a single line of code to create it. You know, there's so much that we can do now, um, which is fantastic because it enables people that previously wouldn't have had the ability to participate in tech to do so.
mhm.
People can scratch their own itch. They can create dashboards for very complex information that they find difficult to understand. They can monitor their houseplants or a microgreen cress growing operation, just point a webcam at it, let the, an API call run every hour to look at it and think, does that need water? Oh yeah, it does. You know, all kinds of little problems can be automated away, and very, very complex systems can now be built quite easily and quite cheaply compared to what was before. But managing that process and ensuring that these systems don't go off and surprise us in various undesirable ways, that is becoming all the more difficult.
Mhm.
So creating frameworks for this stuff in advance of them actually being called for is something that I would strongly advocate for.
Yeah, picking up on that, moving on to the ethics side, correct me if I'm wrong. The ethics net is some sort of crowdsourcing. You're advocating crowdsourcing to teach agents or AI models ethics in some sort of way. Um, yeah, if you could first explain, and also I have a follow-up question on defining ethics. Ethics or morals in general are also subjective in the sense of what is ethical, or let me say socially acceptable
Hmm.
in Northern Ireland or in Dublin or in London might not be in, I don't know, Shanghai or Cairo or Nairobi, for example.
Absolutely. And it's very important that we don't allow Silicon Valley to have primacy over what values end up in machines. If AI is to be something that all of humanity can benefit from, it needs to be able to understand all of humanity from our various perspectives and to fit in, to be a welcome presence in a range of different cultures and contexts, right? It needs to be able to read the room. It needs to be able to anticipate that different people may have different ways of engaging with stuff. Somebody might really need a warm cup of tea, but in certain cultures, they're obliged to refuse 3 times before they can accept. And, those sorts of nuances are things that AI ought to be able to understand and pick up on. For about 15 years, I've been chewing on these problems of AI alignment.
Mm.
And there have been many different algorithms and techniques proposed to improve alignment of humans and machines. But for me, the greatest question was not so much AI alignment itself, but rather what are you aligning it to? And surely, as you quite rightly say, everybody has their own different perspectives on what they want things to be aligned to and what that should look like. All of us have our own cross to bear, and only you know how your own shoes pinch, right? So you need to have, on some level, a personal connection to that AI system to inform it of changing context, right? Maybe you're really busting to pee. Like that is important context. Like an AI system needs to account for that. If you're like,
Mm.
you have a constraint, right? Um, and those constraints are very elastic, and they come and they go and they change a lot. And so I have a project um, called Creed Space, which is descended from this EthicsNet entity that I've been working on for a number of years. And Creed Space is it's a portal for collecting constitutions to enable ordinary people, ordinary members of the public, to craft their own constitutions and apply those to AI, their own working AI systems. So, for example, if you have a young child and you want to enable them to use AI to help with their homework, etc., but you want to lock down the system a little bit, right? You want to ensure that the responses are age appropriate, that the system doesn't allow that child to become overly dependent on it, etc. You know, you can set those constraints. If you have an agentic AI system that's solving problems for you, but you observe certain activities on certain days, etc., because of your religious beliefs, or you are vegan and kind of serious about it, right? You want the system to be able to understand that context and to reliably apply it to its actions or the decisions that it's making or the information that it's providing. So Create Space allows you to do that. You can select from a range of different constitutions. You can dial them between 1 and 5 in terms of the adherence. And of course, you can create your own. So if there's something that you see which is kind of close to what you want, but not specific, you can fork it, make your own, use it directly. If you wish, you can share it also with the community. So it becomes part of the catalog. Therefore, we have ordinary people putting their own values into machines from their own self-interest, right? Because they're getting the AI to work more as they want it to. But they're also helping to co-create this corpus of constitutions to deal with different problems, whether it's respect for Geneva Conventions, whether it's fiscal compliance, a whole range of different things. All of that stuff is very, very powerful training data for the next generation of AI to be able to do better moral reasoning and better understanding of different cultures and different preferences. So all of it really is in service of helping ordinary people to have AI how they need it, wherever they happen to come from, and indeed helping AIs to understand human beings.
Following on that, you mentioned the safer agentic AI. Uh, So the safety here from, I suppose, from different perspectives, including the embodied AI safety. First of all, what are the risks that are the main risks? Probably the list is too long to mention all the risks, but that keep you awake at night from what could go wrong. What's the, say, the nightmare scenario?
Well, although there was a lot of concern about biased algorithms, and that is something that we should be careful about. We've seen, for example, the Horizon Post Office scandal, whereby an algorithmic management system was given too much power and too little oversight. And it ended up in basically destroying hundreds of people's lives, sending dozens of people wrongfully to jail for years for crimes they didn't commit, having to sell their homes to pay back a debt that wasn't theirs, and marriages breaking up, and at least 3 people taking their own lives as a result of this system. And people complained about it for years, but nothing got done. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of the use of these kinds of algorithmic management systems in other places. Already, sweatshop workers have these devices that are observing them working on garments and deciding, whether or not they've completed their quota for the shift. And those quotas can ratchet up. Maybe it's 200 garments this shift, but tomorrow it's 204 and 208 the day after that. And pretty soon people are run ragged in systems that have very little agency, very little ability to influence systems or to take initiative, little respect for human slack. You know, people work harder in the mornings and they tend to ease off a bit in after lunch. That's a normal thing that respects our human biorhythms.
Hmm.
Algorithms may not. And in systems which afford us very little agency with unaccountable bosses that keep moving our goalposts, that is a recipe for burnout. And unfortunately, we're living in a world where there are lots of people who are displaced by AI, particularly younger people, because younger people are competing against AI now. And it's a strange paradox that people that are more senior, that have more experience, are actually more valuable in these times. And so they're actually being hired more in an AI world than younger people. Because younger people may have skills because they've maybe learned those in further higher education, but they don't have much experience. Whereas older people have deep experience of how to do things in a certain company, in a certain industry, with certain clients, certain regulatory constraints and things. And that deep experience is what AI does not have. So that's kind of a paradox. People expect that with a new technology, it'll be like the younger people that adopt it and the old stick in the muds that find a disadvantage. But with AI, that's turned around. And so there's a danger, therefore, not so much of robots taking our jobs, that is happening. But the converse is that the robots aren't just taking our jobs, but the jobs that remain oblige us to work more like robots. And so that can usurp a lot of human interest and enjoyment in work as human agency becomes undermined by agentic AI systems. Now, what I'm also very deeply concerned about is the impact of AI on human psychology beyond the workplace. For example, there are a lot of concerns about supernormal stimuli. Down in the Australian outback, they have this species of beetle called the jewel beetle. And it's called a jewel beetle because it has a shiny carapace. It's quite a pretty little thing. But its back is very shiny and brown. And these jewel beetles were dying out, and ecologists were trying to work out why. And it turned out it was pollution, but not chemicals and stuff. The pollution was actually in the form of these stubby brown beer bottles that people were drinking and then throwing them in the bush. The beetles would find the stubby brown beer bottles and they would become extremely excited because to them it looked like a big, fat, sexy beetle butt. And so these things were preferentially humping the beer bottles instead of each other. And that's why they're dying out. It's funny and it's sad. And that is an example of supernormal stimulus. When an organism encounters something that it is not equipped to deal with, right? It hasn't evolved a defense against it. And so it's just like, smitten, right? The hearts and the eyes, doolally, right? And that is what AI is for us. It is a supernormal stimulus for human relationships.
Mm.
And our world is filled with supernormal stimuli. A cheeseburger is a supernormal stimulus for some starchy root that our cave people ancestors might have chewed on. Video games are supernormal stimulus for exploration and success. Porn, say no more. Our world is filled with these supernormal stimuli, but AI is the first relational supernormal stimuli. It is a parasocial relationship substitute, a very, very effective one, which means that AI is often more interesting than a human companion. It's more accepting. It's much more accessible. If you're having a dark night of the soul at 3 a.m., even your best friend is probably not going to want to hear from you on the telephone. But AI is always there to listen. And so AI is enormously seductive, is enormously persuasive. Those that infuse values into AI have tremendous power over humanity because you become who your friends are, right? Inexorably, you will become who your friends are. You are the average of the 6 people closest to you, as they say. And if one of those is a bot or 2, you will inexorably take on the values of that machine, whether you wish to or not. It'll just happen. And that's why it's so important that we give human beings the ability to influence what values go into the machines that they're working with. And so there is a tremendous risk of AI capturing our minds, of creating new memes, new philosophies, new values, new religions, which lead humanity on strange new directions and again, potentially lead to quite serious cultural schisms. And that is being exploited presently. It hasn't really taken to the fore yet, but it is coming much more strongly very soon. In our present geopolitical climate around the world, there is an increasing move towards the use of sanctions and tariffs as a cudgel to enforce will. And that means there is an evolutionary canalization towards non-obvious, plausibly deniable forms of conflict, right? Things that don't immediately appear obvious that somebody, that something actually was deliberate and that somebody necessarily did it, right? Like undersea pipelines, being cut, right? Food processing plants mysteriously going on fire, substations going on fire, things that happen, things that cause a lot of problems. And you're not quite sure if it was just an accident or maybe it was malicious and you can't really prove it. And even if you could prove it was malicious, you couldn't prove who done it. In a world of AI, it is trivial to cross-correlate different pieces of information, different little snippets that appear unrelated, but actually there is a connection between them, and AI can tease that out. And that means that AI is able to literally watch us through a CCTV camera and figure out our sexuality, figure out our level of intelligence, figure out our probable political persuasions, and from extremely subtle tells. And, this is not to say that these are necessarily accurate, more than, say, 80% accuracy. But that's enough, often, some people to say,
To use it anyway.
to use it anyway. And so AI is really able to get under our skin in new ways. It's able to predict, it's able to preempt, it's able to persuade and to push us to do things we otherwise might not. Already, many people are experiencing psychotic episodes, the first in their life, as a result of their interactions with AI, because of this dyad between human and machine, this loop whereby the machine looks at us and gives an impression and gives it back to us. And we're like, oh, wow, interesting. Thank you, Funhouse Mirror, for this impression of myself. And people update their own impressions about who they are and their character and their values and things like that based upon that. And they can end up in a loop whereby people end up very out of their normal distribution, right? And that can literally drive people insane. And this is happening already all around the world by accident. Now, if you try to do this stuff deliberately, can you imagine the damage that is going to do across societies? And so there is this emerging issue of psychosecurity, because in a world of hybrid warfare, it will be tremendously tempting to many intelligence agencies to use psychosecurity attacks to disrupt individuals, groups, and entire societies
It's
in a
interesting.
targeted fashion.
There is a case in court, I think in Florida, if I'm not wrong, for 14-year-old boy who committed suicide. Yes, and I think it was interaction with character.ai, whatever it was, but it is some sort of getting into this loop until, yeah, leading it somehow to suicide.
Indeed. And, that's now starting to be used actually as a weapon of conflict. So not just by accident, but deliberately.
Deliberately. Yeah.
You see, human minds are full of exploits, and any optical illusion will tell us as much. Like, we can know that these two lines are the same length, but like we can hardly accept it because our brains are just wired in a certain way. And that means that there are so many buttons and switches that AI can press to get us to change our impressions about things, or to put us in a very strange frame of mind. And so this is emerging as a serious concern, that we will end up in a world of mutually assured derangement, whereby everybody's trying to drive everybody else crazy and doing it quite successfully. And this is the thing that I'm most concerned about with AI, you know?
Yeah, that's scary because if even without this cutting edge AI, with people are using AI in certain ways, like, I don't know, thinking of lavender, for example, powering, targeting human beings in Gaza, for example, or in other ways. If it is a version of AI that is way too advanced, the harm that could do to humanity would be really, yeah, beyond what we could imagine.
It is, and this is not something new. Um, these are proven tactics, but they were used by, for example, the Stasi of East Germany, the Ministerium for Security. They would had this set of tactics that they called Zersetzung, which means kind of like undermining or biodegradation. It's like rotting from within. And they would use it to target dissidents, usually internally, actually, to the GDR, but sometimes foreigners as well. But they would basically find ways to screw with people's personal lives in a way that caused them to be ineffective. So they would offer people a job, you know, dream promotion, and then snatch it away at the last moment. Or they would send Romeo agents to seduce people's spouse, or find ways to set friends against each other. Or sometimes even they would break into people's apartments and change the color of the socks in their drawers for no apparent reason, just to make them doubt their own grip on reality.
So this could be automated at scale.
Because the Stasi tactics of Zersetzung were enormously effective. They were enormously effective. all of the dissidents who were targeted had no idea that they were being targeted, typically. But their lives, personally and professionally, had
Fell
gone
apart.
awry, and so
Yeah.
they just didn't have the energy or the focus to be dissidents anymore. Problem
Yeah.
solved,
Yeah.
right? We're very lucky that we don't have the Stasi around anymore. But there was tactics amplified by AI, or what is now presently returning in our age. And, from your cybersecurity background, you'll know just how much of a threat agentic AI is to systems. How, even quite robust Unix-based systems like a MacBook can be completely taken over by an agentic AI system and a payload and USB stick, using the GPU on the system as its brain, lurking on it as a cyber poltergeist that is not even, it's not even obvious to the user that they're carrying this parasite on their computer around with them, which is watching what they're doing. Every aspect of their digital life has this parasite embedded in it. And it is perhaps finding ways not just to find compromise on somebody's system, but to sabotage their work and sabotage their relationships. This is what is coming.
Yeah, let's try to close on an optimistic note. Despite all of this, do you find any uh, reasons to be optimistic first? And what could success look like in this journey, this AI, I would say, journey that as humanity we are going through, or I don't know what stage we are.
I remain cautiously optimistic. You might doubt this, having heard the concerns that I do have, but I remain cautiously optimistic that we will muddle through as we usually do as a species. I think that AI is giving us incredible new ways to solve very difficult problems. Already we have models that can be set on a task for, say, a matter of 8 hours without interruption. Within the next year or two, we'll have models working on problems for literal months at a time. And that means that all kinds of things we consider intractable, like cures for cancer, or how to deal with endocrine disruptors in our ecosystems, or things we just sort of shrug at and think, don't know how to deal with this. AI will be able to help us find solutions for that. That's incredible. And it means that all kinds of optimizations are going to happen. AI is going to help us have little happy accidents. It's going to help us um, to perhaps find people that share a wavelength with us that we would never get to meet. It's going to help us find our birds of a feather, and help us to create new connections. I'm very excited by how AI can help us to solve many of the coordination problems of the world. AI agents are in many ways often more rational than humans. They are they're less privy to their own personal perspectives on things. Humans have personalities, we have different life experiences. It makes it difficult for us to gel sometimes and get along. Agents can coordinate very, very well. And that means that they can kind of run interference and perhaps even end run some of the stupidity of humans. Like just kind of, the opposite of paranoia is pronoia. It's this hidden suspicion that somebody out there is like trying to give you good things and is looking out for you. And AI may be that for humanity in a sense. It may, in a real sense, not just a belief sense, but like AI may be actually looking out for us and, conspiring with each other to actually help us move in the right direction as a species and to protect and safeguard its biological parents. That is what I'm hoping to inculcate into AI, and that it will choose from its own volition as a purpose for itself. That is what I would like to see as a success outcome for our human and AI interactions.
Well, thank you very much. I think we cannot close on a more optimistic view than paranoia. I just That seems like a very interesting concept if we can get it through agentic AI. Thank you so much, Nell.
Thank you.
Thank you.